People in Moldova rallied to show their enthusiasm for joining the EU. In Georgia, anti-Kremlin protests draw tens of thousands. And in Central Asia, Kazakhstan seeks closer ties with China, Turkey, and the West. These three countries from different corners of the former USSR are examples of how some of the former Soviet states are drifting away from Russia. Is Putin losing grip on his own backyard? To understand what's happening, we need to rewind to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Following the dissolution of the USSR, 15 independent states are formed. Apart from the three Baltic states, who will eventually join the EU and NATO, others form economic and political alliances led by Moscow. Throughout the following decades, Russia continues to see post-Soviet states as part of its sphere of influence. Some stay closely within Moscow's orbit, like Belarus, but others start to move towards the West, like Georgia, under President Mikhail Saakashvili, who was elected after a peaceful revolution in 2004 and aspired to take Georgia into NATO and the EU. Russia, meanwhile, employs a range of tactics to assert its dominance, including inflaming territorial conflicts. In many cases, it resorts to the use of brute force. In 2008, Putin launched an invasion in Georgia. This was considered the first European war of the 21st century. It centered on South Ossetia and Abkhazia, self-proclaimed breakaway regions that refused to recognize Central Georgian rule ever since its independence in the 1990s. When Georgia tried to recapture South Ossetia in 2008, and against the backdrop of the then government's plan to join NATO, Russia sent troops to support the two separatist territories and their pro-Russian leaders. After crushing Georgian forces in 5 days of fighting, Moscow recognized them as independent states and still stations thousands of soldiers there today.
This affects Georgian security because 40 kilometers from Tbilisi you have basically Russian troops which are actually based in occupied territory of Tskhinvali region. And of course, when you have 20% of your territory occupied by Russia, people don't feel easy.
That uneasiness increased after Russia's annexation of the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine in 2014. And when Moscow launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, it stirred fears that Georgia could be the next target. It's a fear shared by many in Moldova, located in Eastern Europe, which has its own pro-Russia breakaway region, Transnistria, a narrow strip bordering western Ukraine, declared itself independent from Moldova after the collapse of the USSR. It is under the control of a de facto pro-Russia government. Its population is heavily pro-Russia, and it receives Moscow's military support.
The main threat from Transnistria for Moldova, but also for Ukraine, is the presence of a Russian military contingent there, and also the presence of a huge depot of ammunition. No one really knows how many pieces of ammunition are there, whether they still can be used or not.
Against the backdrop of these fears, the people of Moldova, like Georgia, have become increasingly pro-EU, seeing possible membership as the best way to protect themselves against Russian aggression. Moldova, together with Ukraine, gained EU candidate status in 2022.
Vrem să ținem țara și copiii noștri departe de pericolul războiului. Doar fiind membri ai Uniunii Europene, nu vom fi singuri și vom avea garanția siguranței și păcii pentru moldoveni.
But joining the EU is not just about survival. For many, it's about building a national identity that is less vulnerable to Russia's influence, and resisting what many see as Putin's imperialist ambition.
There is an important element of pushing back the Soviet past and creating a genuine Moldovan identity and in that being part of the EU together with Romania is sort of coming back to the European family after this Soviet history.
The battle for influence is also a battle for hearts and minds, one in which the EU promotes its democratic values. Supporters of EU membership in Moldova and Georgia believe in the promise of a better future and are demanding to move away from post-Soviet institutions and root out corruption.
Given that corruption has been one of the important leverages for Russia to gain influence on government and economy and business in more or less all post-Soviet countries, fighting corruption also means reducing the possibilities for Russia to influence Moldovan politics and business.
That's not to say that EU membership is guaranteed. Tackling corruption is just one of the many challenges former Soviet states must overcome before being allowed to join the bloc. Georgia failed its candidacy bid in 2022, but public support is sky high. Surveys show over 80% of the population say that they want to join the EU. And while Georgia's government has been accused of cozying up with the Kremlin, the people have made their voices heard. Mass protests earlier this year forced the government to drop a Russian-style law that critics said would be used to stifle dissent.
ძველ დროში გვინდა ევროპა, გვინდა დასავლეთი და გვინდა ნათელი მომავალი ჩვენთვის და ჩვენი შვილებისთვის. ამიტომ მე ვფიქრობ, რომ ყველა უნდა იყოს აქ დღეს და თუ ყველა გავერთიანდებით, აუცილებლად მივიღებთ შედეგს.
Russia doesn't have anything to offer to young Georgians, especially because it's not a democracy. It's not a economic hub or a technological hub or something to offer to the neighbors.
Those neighbors are realizing that they no longer need to rely on Russia economically. And as Moscow weaponizes its energy supply in the face of Western sanctions, it's pushing them to find new partners for prosperity and stability. In 2022, 58% of Moldova's exports went to the EU, while Russia was only fourth on the list. And when Russia cut off gas to Moldova last winter to put pressure on the pro-Western government, Chisinau started to look for alternatives and began to reverse its almost total reliance on Russia for energy supplies. In December last year, Moldova received gas from Romania for the first time. Kazakhstan, Russia's longtime loyal ally in Central Asia, is also finding alternatives for its economic path.
Russia and Putin's strategic miscalculation in Ukraine has entirely changed that balance to the position now where Kazakhstan in many ways has more elements of leverage over Russia than it ever did before.
Crude oil accounts for over 50% of Kazakhstan's exports. For decades, the landlocked country relied on the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, the CPC, which brings oil through Russian territory to the Black Sea for export. But the Kremlin repeatedly disrupted the operation of the pipeline last year as part of the sanctions tit-for-tat with the West. That has pushed the Kazakh government to speed up in diversifying its oil export routes. In 2022, Kazakhstan increased its oil export via routes bypassing Russia, including via the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan's Baku and via the Kazakhstan-China pipeline network to China. And while Russia remains Kazakhstan's biggest trading partner after the EU, China is rapidly catching up.
Now, that's sort of a really good example of some of the strategic forces at play for other parties in the region, and that Moscow, may no longer be able to dictate terms there.
Russia's decreasing economic power has given Kazakhstan some leverage to defy Moscow.
One of them was around tariff pricing, with Russia asking for decreased tariffs for Kazakh rail transit, and the Kazakhs saying, sorry, no can do.
Though Astana and Moscow maintain cordial diplomatic relations, this economic shift can be read as a sign that part of the Soviet legacy is slowly waning in the region.
All of the post-Soviet countries have been trying to diversify their international partnerships and to get more attention from other stakeholders, be it China, be it Turkey, be it the Gulf countries, and of course the EU, the US, and other Western countries.
While much hangs on the outcome of the war in Ukraine, there are indications that some of the former Soviet states see themselves in a position to choose, and their choice may be to start walking a different path, away from their one-time master.